£115 billion, which supports over 2.5 million jobs across both our countries. This is second only to the EU, where our trading relationship is worth £791 billion. Yesterday evening, the United States announced a 10% reciprocal tariff on UK exports and have today imposed a 25% global tariff on cars. This follows the application of tariffs of 25% on US imports of steel, aluminium and derivative products that was announced on the 12th of March. No country was able to secure an exemption from these announcements, but the UK did receive the lowest reciprocal tariff rate globally. And though this vindicates the pragmatic approach this government has taken, we know that while these tariffs are still being levied, the job is far from done. We are, of course, disappointed by the increase in tariffs on the UK and on other countries around the world. The impact will be felt amongst all trading nations. But I would like to update the House on how the UK can navigate these turbulent times, acting in our national interest and for the benefit of all our industries. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank my American counterparts, Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick, US Trade Representative Jameson Greer, and Special Envoy Mark Burnett for their engagement over the last few months. While any imposition of tariffs is deeply regrettable, from the beginning they promised to make themselves available and have been true to their word, and I look forward to our continued engagement over the days ahead. As members will know, since the new US administration took office, my colleagues and I have been engaged in intensive discussions on an economic deal between the US and the UK, one that would not just avoid the imposition of significant tariffs, but that would deepen our economic relationship. On everything from defence, economic security, financial services, machinery, tech and regulation, there are clear synergies between the US and UK markets. And this is reflected in the fair and balanced trading relationship that already exists between our two countries. I can confirm to the House that those talks are ongoing and will remain so. It is this government's view that a deal is not just possible, it is favourable to both countries, and that this course of action serves Britain's interests as an open-facing trading nation. I've been in contact with many businesses across a broad range of sectors, including those most affected, who have very much welcomed this approach. It is clear to me that industry themselves want to grasp the opportunity a deal can offer, and they welcome this government's cool-headed approach. Madam Deputy Speaker, in increasingly insecure times, I have heard some members cling to the security of simple answers and loud voices. I understand the compulsion, but I caution members of this House to keep calm and remain clear-eyed on what is in our national interest, not to simply proclaim that we follow the actions of other countries. The British people rightly expect this government to keep our country secure at home and abroad. An unnecessary, escalating trade war would serve neither purpose. True strength comes in making the right choices at the right time. And thanks to the actions of our Prime Minister, who has restored Britain's place on the world stage, the UK is in a unique position to do a deal where we can and respond when we must. It remains our belief that the best route to economic stability for working people is a negotiated deal with the US that builds on our shared strengths. However, we do reserve the right to take any action we deem necessary if a deal is not secured. To enable the UK to have every option open to us in future, I am today launching a request for input on the implications for British businesses of possible retaliatory action. This is a formal step necessary for us to keep all options on the table. We will seek the views of UK stakeholders over 4 weeks until the 1st of May 2025 on products that could potentially be included in any UK tariff response. This exercise will also give businesses the chance to have their say and influence the design of any possible UK action. If we are in a position to agree an economic deal with the US that lifts the tariffs that have been placed on our industries, this request for input will be paused, and any measures flowing from that will be lifted. Further information on the request for input will be published on gov.uk later today, alongside an indicative list of potential products that the government considers most appropriate for inclusion. I know this will be an anxious time for all businesses, not just those with direct trade links to America. And let me say very clearly that we stand ready to support businesses through this. That starts by making sure they have reliable information. And any business which is concerned about what these changes mean for them can find clear guidance and support on great.gov.uk, where there is now a bespoke web page. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government was elected to bring security back to working people's lives. And at a time of volatility, businesses and workers alike are looking to the government to keep our heads, to act in our national interest, and to navigate Britain through this period. And while some urge escalation, I simply will not play politics with people's jobs. Yeah. This government will strive for a deal that supports our industries and the well-paid jobs that come with them, while preparing our trade defences and keeping all options on the table. It is the right approach to defend the UK's domestic industries from the direct and indirect impacts of US tariffs in a way which is both measured and proportionate, while respecting the rules-based international trading system. As the world continues to change around us, British workers and businesses can be assured of one constant, and that this is a government that will not be set off course in choppy waters. So the final part of our approach will be to turbo boost the work this government is doing to make our economy stronger and more secure, including our new industrial strategy. And we will strike trade deals with our partners and work closely with our allies for our shared prosperity. We have a clear destination to deliver that economic security for working people. We're progressing a deal that can do that. We're laying the foundations to move quickly, should it not. And we're ensuring British business have a clear voice in what happens next. And I commend this statement to the House.
Yeah. For the Shadow Secretary of State, Andrew Griffith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. Businesses, workers and their families woke up this morning with greater fear and more uncertainty about their future. Tariffs makes us all poorer by pushing up costs, suppressing demand and making the pound in our pocket buy less of the things that we need. It's free trade to which we owe our past prosperity, and free trade which has lifted billions out of poverty since the Second World War. So this is a moment for calm words and cool heads, and we will support the government when it does sensible things to reverse the impact on our already fragile economy. I'm glad the government has recommitted to reaching a deal with our closest ally and largest single country trading partner. But this is also a moment for honesty and telling the truth. The government sadly got no special favours from the White House last night. The Secretary of State refers to vindication. This is no vindication at all. We're in precisely the same band as the Congo, Costa Rica, Kosovo and the Christmas Islands. In fact, I count over 125 countries and territories that have the same tariff levels as the US as we now do. So not that special. Our automotive manufacturers face unchanged tariffs of 25% on around £8 billion worth of cars and auto part exports. Steel and aluminium exports remain at 25%. And on a volume-weighted basis, our exports face an average tariff of closer to 13%. Above all, last night was a vindication of those who were pilloried and abused for wanting our country to have the freedom to decide our own trade policy. If Labour and the Liberal Democrats had their way, we'd still be in the EU. As the Prime Minister acknowledged this morning, thousands of British jobs have been saved today as the result. And I hope the Right Honourable Gentleman and his colleagues had the decency to regret the 48 times they voted to stay in Europe and to thank us for getting Brexit done. Madam Deputy Speaker, last week, the OBR warned that these tariffs could knock up to 1% off GDP. We're already in a per capita recession and markets are falling this morning. It's businesses that create jobs and grow our economy. Yet at every turn, the government has piled on headwinds when they need our support. They've put a tax on jobs, more than doubled business rates for many, introduced the family business death tax and are barrelling ahead with flawed recycling charges. No wonder business confidence remains at rock bottom. To help British exporters survive, they must urgently tackle our sky-high energy costs. A business in Birmingham, the West Midlands, faces energy costs 4 times their competitor in Birmingham, Alabama, in the US. That dwarfs the impact of tariffs and is no basis on which to compete. The Secretary of State himself is responsible for the Employment Rights Bill. It'll hit businesses so hard, the OBR has not even begun to assess how much it will hurt the economy. So now is the time, today is the day. In the national interest, the Secretary of State must walk back to his department and instruct his officials, shelve the Employment Rights Bill today. Put ideology aside, put the unions on hold and put the government on the side of British business. The cost of failure is too high. The burdens on business are too great. Time is too precious. He must act and act fast. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me conclude with some questions to the Secretary of State on behalf of all of our constituents. Will he publish an urgent assessment of the impact of today's tariffs on the UK economy so markets can see whether the Chancellor's emergency budget sums still add up or she'll be back for more taxes? When will he give the car makers the clarity they need on the ZEV mandate? Will he undertake to keep Parliament informed and to publish the UK's broader objectives, not negotiating strategy, but the broader objectives in these trade negotiations with the US, precisely as the previous government did in March 2020? Will he assure us that any deal will back British farmers and food producers and uphold our high environmental protection and the animal welfare standards which we ourselves enhanced since leaving the EU and upheld in the agreements we reached? Will he now surge additional resources for exporters, reallocating resources across government to fund a new version of the UK trade show programme and enlarging the GREAT campaign? What consideration is the government giving to the special situation of Northern Ireland? Will he guarantee that all claims under the duty reimbursement scheme for Northern Ireland will be paid promptly and the government will commit additional resources when required? Can he reassure us that in the event the UK did see a major trade distortion in Northern Ireland, the government would be prepared, if necessary, to trigger Article 16 of the Windsor Framework? Will he reassure the House that any concessions to UK tech giants on the digital services tax won't simply shift the burden to the United Kingdom small businesses? Madam Deputy Speaker, on this side of the House, we are on the side of business and on the side of Britain. We understand the gravity of this situation. We will support the government where it acts in the national interests. I hope they will take this moment seriously, get back round the table with their US counterparts and involve the House in their deliberations.
Secretary of State Jonathan Reynolds.
Well, I thank the Shadow Minister for his statement and his tone in responding, and I recognise that his commitment to free trade and the case he has made for that, which I believe is one that we broadly share. He asks for honesty. I think that is always good in Parliament. He's a little bit flippant about the position that we find ourselves in today. He mentions a series of countries, Christmas Islands, Kosovo, who don't have the kind of complex trading relationships we have with the United States. I would just say to him, he can see in my tone and my presentation, in my words today, there is disappointment from me that we are in this position, but I do look at the EU, which faces a tariff of 20%, Japan 24%, India 26%. I look at the 25% tariffs already in place, and Canada and Mexico. So yes, we're in a more favourable position compared to those key friends and allies, but we must go further, particularly in relation to the tariffs on automotive, which is a particular concern for me. He brings up Brexit again. I would say perhaps not the finest hour in terms of the state's preparation for large trade shocks in the Conservative Party, but let's pass that over. Of course, as the President of the Board of Trade, I am of the view that it's good that we can set our own trade policy. But I would just say to him, and I would mean this to all colleagues, isn't it time to try and unite the country about the future, rather than always harbour back to the past? Isn't that the way we will all find our way through that? And I just think, look, half the country voted one way, half the other way. Let's build that together, and please let's look to the future. That is the right way forward. I would also say, and this is a very important point, it is not a choice. It is a false choice to see this as being presented as between working with the US or the EU. We can do this in a way that is consistent with both, and we should all be committed to that. He asks about the implications for the United Kingdom. He broadly asked me to reverse a series of policy choices made in the last 14 years, and I'll go through all of those. I would say in relation to the spring statement, the Chancellor only rebuilt the headroom caused by some of this global turbulence to a substantial degree higher than that which was bequeathed to her by the Conservative Party. I'd also say, on Conservative spending plans, there was no relief for business rates whatsoever in what we were left. That was a one-year relief rolled over that never had any longevity from the Conservative Party. And I haven't yet received any credible proposals from the party opposite to pay for their spending plans, but I'm always available to receive those in writing, Madam Deputy Speaker. He asks for reassurance. Of course, we're always happy to provide that on policy changes domestically. He knows we're more pragmatic in our approach on things like the ZEV mandate for the automotive sector than the Conservative Party was in office. He knows the Department of Transport leads on that policy, but the publication of our response to the consultation for potential changes will be published soon. I won't comment on the details of any negotiations with the US. I think colleagues would expect that, but our SPS system, our commitment to that for food standards and food safety in the UK was a manifesto commitment, and of course we will adhere to that on this side of the House. I think he also knows we are imminently preparing to publish our trade strategy, which covers a lot of the issues, particularly around support for exporters, that we want to proceed with. On Northern Ireland, I will just spend a moment on this because this is an incredibly important issue for all colleagues. Of course, the potential for a differential response from the European Union to ourselves could lead to a difficult situation in Northern Ireland. The duty reimbursement scheme that he highlights is the key policy here, because goods entering Northern Ireland which from the US, which are not going into the wider single market, are then subject to the reimbursement programme. We do have to make sure that works well. I absolutely recognise the points he has made on that, and I will continue to update the House and all colleagues with our work in this area. I recognise how important it is, how relevant it is to all of our constituents, and of course we'll endeavour to keep all colleagues updated on progress.
Annalise Dodds.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Workers at BMW Cowley are deeply concerned by recent news. BMW is right. A trade war would have no benefits, and the Secretary of State is right to engage calmly with his US counterparts. But can I ask what discussions he's had with his EU counterparts, given how integrated our automotive sector is with that in EU countries?
My honourable friend, very much for her question. She is absolutely right that in some of our iconic automotive manufacturing brands, BMW, JLR, Aston Martin, who are particular success in the US market and therefore exposure to this. There is within government very close cooperation between the teams that are working on our EU reset and our trade negotiations in this area. So I can assure her of the alignment, of the continuity and consistency of policy in that area, as well as the changes to, for instance, like domestic policies like the ZEV mandate. She will know in the budget there was significant money for incentivising, for instance, the rollout of infrastructure for electric vehicles, £2 billion put aside for the wider joint collaboration and R&D initiatives with the automotive sector. So this remains a clear and consistent government priority, and again I'll keep her updated with the particular constituency interests that she has.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I thank the Business Secretary for advance sight of his statement. Donald Trump has launched a destructive trade war that threatens the jobs and living standards of people across the UK and around the world. And let's be clear, this is not about reciprocity or a level playing field. The US is conflating our high British standards with trade barriers, and they're doing it on purpose. This is Donald Trump saying to the UK that he'll only lower tariffs if we lower standards. He's saying, sell out your NHS to US vulture firms or else. Sell out your farmers to US big business or else. And give up protections against online scammers and for children's safety to US tech barons or else. If the government gives in to Trump's threats, it will only encourage him to use the same bullying tactics again and again. it is simultaneously true that the way that the White House has made its crude calculation actually makes Britain's negotiation position a bit better than other countries, and we genuinely welcome that. That is a relief to us all. But, and I say this with regret, there is no sign that the government's lobbying has borne any fruit, given that we have been put on the same regime as a number of other countries, such as Honduras, Peru, Guatemala, and others. This must be a wake-up call. We Liberal Democrats believe that we must end this trade war as quickly as possible, and that means standing firm with our allies against Trump's attempts to divide and rule. So will the government take urgent steps to bring our Commonwealth and European partners together in an economic coalition of the willing against Trump's tariffs? We welcome this 1 month of consultation with business. Will the government confirm it will look at energy costs and business rates reform as part of that 4-week consultation, especially with the car industry? And at the same time, will that 4-week consultation be run in parallel with talk with our allies to draw up the use of retaliatory tariffs in a coordinated way? When does the government expect to publish an impact assessment of these tariffs on our small businesses, jobs and the cost of living? Will the government look seriously at launching talks with the EU to create a bespoke customs union? And let us be clear, the UK would not be in a worse place if the government had heeded our calls to negotiate a customs union. Either the Conservative Party should be able to see that Turkey has been in a customs union with the EU since 1995, and they have likewise been hit only with 10% tariffs. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, will the government rule out once and for all that they will not water down the digital services tax or our digital competition regulations to appease Trump's billionaire backers?
I'm grateful to the honourable member for her questions and her submission. I'm pleased to hear she feels we need to end any potential trade war. I'm pretty certain I heard her on the media last week demanding that we escalate that trade war, and I don't think that is in any of our interests or the route and direction that we need to go in. She mentions there's no sign of the UK being treated in any different way. She will know the US have a view of VAT that we do not share, and they compare that to their sales tax. And our rate of VAT, look at the comparable treatment to the European Union, there is a differential there. It's one that doesn't satisfy me, because I believe we could seriously get to a position where we're not only avoiding the imposition of additional trade tariffs and barriers, we could be deepening our trade relationship and removing some of the barriers that already exist, particularly in trade in services. So that is the objective of the government. And of course we work very closely with a whole range of friends and allies. But when they go into any negotiation, they're representing their own national or customs union interest, and we do the same. I wouldn't expect any country to go into a negotiation trying to represent the UK. They will have their own interests, and what I do is simply the same for the United Kingdom. I've got to put our own interests first, and there is a different structure to our trading relationship between the US and the UK. The US, for instance, does not have a large deficit in traded goods that they have with the EU or with China. So it's a different level of conversation, and it allows us to put our own interests first. And that is all we are seeking to do with the government in our policy towards the US. She mentions a range of other issues which I identify. I think colleagues know I have very strong views on the very large increases in industrial energy costs which occurred after 2010, almost a 50% increase in real terms. And I do think they need to be addressed. The industrial strategy and other initiatives from government are the wider policy objectives and tools that we have around this. It's much more in terms of the consultation and the call for input what we have called for in relation to this, the formal steps that we need to do to take the impact from business themselves and their chance to put their views forward as part of it that I have announced today, which, as I say, would not be necessary if we can come to an agreement. I believe all members of the House would want to see us do that. I believe this relationship can be deepened. It doesn't come at a cost to other key trading relationships if we get it right, such as the one between ourselves and the European Union. So that is the objective of the government, and I welcome any support from all sides of the House in fulfilling that objective.
Callum Anderson.
Deputy Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his statement. The dramatic shift in US trade policy yesterday marks an historic abdication from the principles of open commerce and global trade that has underpinned the economies of the Western world since the end of the Second World War. Tariffs bring no winners, only losers, in the form of higher costs for consumers and higher barriers to business and industry. Can the Secretary of State set out how this government is working with international institutions such as the World Trade Organization to prevent further escalation and position the UK as a leading champion for open markets?
Well, I warmly welcome the question from my honourable friend. He is right to say this is a substantial change in US policy. I think it's important that even if we do not agree with some of the decisions and the thinking that underpins that we recognise where that comes from, and indeed this was part of the US presidential campaign. So we've been able to prepare the ground for these conversations. He asked a specific question about international cooperation. We are strongly involved with the WTO, and particularly supported the re-election of Dr. Ngozi as the Director General. It's important to remember that despite the problems the multilateral system faces, it is still the basis upon which the vast majority of trade around the world takes place, and will continue to play a very constructive role in relation to the WTO and any multilateral organisation which serves our own interests to do so as well.
Barclay.
What was missing from the Secretary of State's statement, and indeed his reply to both opposition front benches, is the government's estimate of the cost of these tariffs, particularly in the context of the Chancellor's fiscal headroom. Could he now update the House on that specifically?
To him for his question, he will know as a former Treasury Minister the kind of work that goes on to make sure those assessments are made. The announcement was made late last night. We had the chance to respond yesterday evening and this morning to it. He will also appreciate that the impact on the UK is not just about the direct relationship between the US and the UK, but what happens in the wider global trading system. How other countries choose to react to the announcements in the US will be the determining factor for the impact upon the UK, and we will not know that at this stage. But I promise him I will keep the House updated, and him personally if he wishes, at any stage as to our work to assess what the impact will be on the UK. But also that I believe for all members of Parliament this should be a time for reassurance, for calm heads, for clear information to British business as to how we will navigate these difficult times. I think that is the correct message to be sending out from Parliament.
Della Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I suspect that the opposition front bench, if they're still trying to propagate the arguments of 2016, are a bit drunk on chlorinated chicken. We need to get real. Celebrating a tariff of 10% rather than 20% is like celebrating that when you got mugged, they only took your wallet and not your watch as well. That's why the British public deserve better. That's why I'm grateful that the Secretary of State is talking about our relationship with Europe, because who knows what President Trump will bring next week. We do 5 times more business with the European Union than we do with America. It is in our interest to have a close and stable trading relationship with Europe, but right now that is up for grabs too. So could the Secretary of State just set out for us what this now means for his negotiations on the European reset and the summit in May?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for her question. I would just be clear again, no one is celebrating the position we find ourselves in as a country this morning. No one is celebrating that. We recognise the differential that the UK finds itself in, but all of us, I believe all on all sides of the House, are disappointed by the announcements from the United States and are seeking to provide a way through that. I reiterate to her, I know she feels very strongly about this, this is not a choice between the US and the EU. It doesn't have to be. These are two key and long-term and important trading partners, and actually security and defence partners as well. The EU summit that she mentions next month is a key event. Our aspirations for an ambitious EU reset on a trade basis to rectify some of the flaws in the agreement agreed under the previous government remain. Our objectives there are clear, and they were all in the manifesto that we on this side of the House stood on and won the election. So that remains a key priority, and again I share with her the alignment between the EU reset and this negotiation is very strong within government.
Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Business Secretary delayed and dithered for 5 months before meeting his US counterpart. And that dereliction of duty, his refusal to meet earlier, is a price that working people and businesses in the UK are now paying. So does he regret his refusal to meet his US counterpart earlier?
The Honourable Lady is incorrect, and I've got to ask her to take a bit more of a serious tone with the questions that she brings to board. This is really serious stuff. I've met my counterparts on many occasions. We were in contact even before some of the formal procedures on the US side that they were confirmed. So it wasn't technically even in any way possible to be in touch with them sooner. Their engagement has been consistent and serious. The Honourable Lady is incorrect, and please approach these very important proceedings with a little bit more seriousness.
Ben Esterson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The impact of the US tariffs has very serious implications for UK industry. It's a reminder of the importance of the industrial strategy and of support from government, including for domestic steelmaking capability, something the party opposite, sadly, over 14 years, very badly neglected. So can my right honourable friend confirm that he is fully committed to the plan for steel and the importance of our sovereign steelmaking capacity?
Grateful to my honourable friend for his question and the work he and I did together over many years in opposition in this area. He knows the commitment of this government and this side of the House to the steel industry. It is, of all the issues of industrial neglect, we were bequeathed some of the harder issues to resolve. There is no doubt about that. Whether it is the future of British Steel at Scunthorpe and Teesside, or our aspirations under the steel strategy for new investments, new technology in terms of that sovereign capability. He knows the ambition on this side of the House is very strong. The issues are difficult, particularly difficult, I should say, this week, and I know all the workers at Scunthorpe are particularly concerned about that. But the commitment and the work of this government to the steel sector will go on.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can the Minister offer us any guarantee that the Government will not enter into a trade deal with America that will allow for the importation and sale in this country of food products that are produced to a lower environmental and animal welfare standard than those that we demand of United Kingdom farmers?
I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question. He knows I won't go into the detail of any negotiation, but as I said to the opposition front bench, he knows our commitment, our manifesto commitment to our SPS regime, and that is a very important commitment on this side of the House, affecting all of our trade negotiations, not just this one.
Jenny Riddle-Carpenter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I start by welcoming the Secretary of State's statement this morning. The Port of Felixstowe is the UK's busiest container shipping port in the UK. Though we import more than we export, we are also the 9th largest exporter in the UK, and the USA market is important for our local and national trading market. Last night's news will likely have a significant impact on the global trading markets, and it's not an exaggeration to say it could potentially change the global trading consensus of the last 80 years. Just as President Trump is acting in what he believes is his national interest, can the Secretary of State reassure me and my constituents in Felixstowe and across my constituency of Suffolk Coastal that the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister will act firmly in our national interest and do whatever is necessary to protect British jobs, British trade and industry and British consumers?
Well, she is right to talk about the significance of the decision and announcements last night, the historical scale of that, and particularly for her constituents and economic infrastructure so vital to the country, what that means to process the scale of some of those changes. But yes, I can assure her, whether it is myself as the Secretary of State, that the Prime Minister, all members of the Cabinet, and the decisions we've had to make at pace in order to get us to the position to put our own national interest forward in a way that's allowed us to progress some of these negotiations and keep open opportunities for the future. I can tell her we'll be doing that at all times.
Reynolds.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. For all the carefully choreographed bonhomie in the Oval Office last November, the Prime Minister has failed to subsequently secure a US military backstop for his coalition, and now, despite Number 10 briefing out a narrative about productive discussions at the weekend, the Prime Minister admitted to business leaders earlier that clearly there will be an economic impact from the decisions the US has taken. On Times Radio this morning, the Business Secretary said he would roll up his sleeves to try to remove the impact on businesses entirely. That's a bold claim to make given the circumstances. So the impact the Chancellor's budget is already having. What time frame does he envisage an economic deal with the US, and what is he doing until the 1st of May whilst waiting for the views of UK shareholders?
Well, I thank him for his question. He will have heard this morning, myself on the media and here in Parliament, being very clear about how we feel about these decisions, which are that we are deeply disappointed that no country has been able to secure an exemption from them, but we remain committed to the kind of work we've been working very hard on to deliver the opportunities, deliver the potential way as a way through this. And he asks specific questions about how we will respond to this. Well, the content of my statement, respectfully, in terms of how we will ask British businesses to begin to work with us on the formal steps necessary in order to do that. And on the time frame, I shadowed a lot of business secretaries, Conservative business secretaries, over the last few years. There was a fairly rapid turnover at one point, and some of them gave all kinds of timeframes and commitments on trade deals. That's not in our interests because, of course, it puts pressure on you in your negotiations. A lot of this will be held on the US side in terms of the timescales they want to engage upon. But I can tell them I believe there is no country in the world further advanced in the talks that they're having with the United States, and there is hope and optimism that comes from that.
Chi Anwara, who will be followed by Steve Darling. Chi Anwara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The US is our closest ally, the world's largest economy, as well as being the UK's greatest source of foreign direct investment. So I welcome my right honourable friend's calm and pragmatic approach, as well as his determination not to abandon British workers' rights in the face of these tariffs, as urged by the Conservatives, but rather to focus on the trade talks. And on those talks, could he confirm whether the Online Safety Act, the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act, and/or the digital sales tax are part of those talks? And could you also say a little bit more about his counter-argument to the Trump administration's view that VAT and the DST represent tariffs rather than tax?
I thank her for her question. She reminds me I didn't get a chance to respond to the opposition front bench, but I do feel if we came to Parliament today following these announcements in the United States and said, you know what, the answer to this is that low-paid people aren't going to get the sick pay they're otherwise going to get under this Labour government, I think that would be the wrong response to the kind of announcements that we have seen. And again, as ever, it would be scapegoating the wrong people for difficult things that have nothing to do with their own position in the UK economy. My honourable friend asks a number of questions very skillfully in terms of how many she leveraged into that question. Look, there are real differences of opinion between ourselves and the United States on something like VAT. We would say that it applies, and it does apply, to domestically produced goods as much as goods that come into the UK, and that is not trade distorting, and indeed the relationship, the balance of trade between the US and the UK is evidence of that. The argument from the US is slightly different. I will not go into the content of all of the negotiations, and she will appreciate that. But success in any negotiation is recognising the other side's argument, putting your own forward, but being willing to get round the table and do that. And that is the approach of this government. That is the way forward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And we must stand up to this bully that is Trump and support British business. This morning, I reached out to a manufacturer in Torbay, Gooch and Housego, who manufacture high fibre optics that help facilitate international communications. They have interests in manufacturing in the US, the UK, Europe and Thailand. It is now an extremely complex world that they have to navigate, and other players in the high-tech sector. How does the Minister plan to help the high-tech sector navigate this challenging world we now live in?
Well, I thank him for his question. I would say our job is to defend the UK national interest, and the kind of company that he has described in his constituency in Torbay, which sounds like a fantastic company, again an example of why I want businesses based in the UK, because they can then access a whole range of markets from the best possible position. It is exactly the kind of company that will have, because of those complex supply chains, questions about what this means for them. And the decision to launch bespoke information on great.gov.uk today to coincide with this announcement is precisely our attempt to provide them with the assurance that they need. I'd also say a business like that can genuinely help us through this difficult period, because whatever colleagues, members think of the President and his agenda, it is based on returning a certain type of good quality manufacturing job to the United States. And actually, British firms and British business in many cases already provide those, and they will provide more if we find our way through these trade tensions and the imposition of tariffs, so they can work with us on the solution to these problems. I'm grateful to him for putting that company forward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm really pleased to hear the Secretary of State's commitment to steel. Stocksbridge Speciality Steels in my constituency is a strategically significant site with world-class unique capability for creating specialist parts, which will be essential in increasing our defence capacity and net zero infrastructure. Last week, I held a community listening event on the government's excellent steel strategy. The message was clear: let's ensure British-made steel is best. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that today's news further demonstrates why it is so important that this government is committed to a £2.5 billion plan for steel?
I'm grateful to her and for her advocacy for steel as well, which I graciously appreciate. She puts the case extremely well, which is the kind of products that we're making in the UK in the steel sector, and which in the main where we export them to the US are niche, they're high value, they're in critical sectors like defence and the manufacturing supply chain. They're complementary to the US. It's a good case of why I believe there are no argument for the imposition of tariffs in this sector, because our steel sector is complementary to the US, whether that's in defence or the manufacturing supply chain. So that's the basis upon which I think we could find a way through this. And she's right to say the level of domestic support has increased considerably through the steel strategy and the £2.5 billion, £3 billion in total, including Port Talbot, that we put forward as this government. It's very, very important to us that we deal and support the foundation industries. The steel strategy is a clear example of that.
The Steel constituency, Matt Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Dealing with the erratic Trump administration must be something of a nightmare for negotiations. But the unexpected can always emerge from the White House. But the one certainty has been that tariffs were going to form a part of the Trump agenda. And it's somewhat surprising that the Minister is only today launching a consultation about the implications of retaliatory measures. But building on the previous questions about steel, would you at least acknowledge that the current uncertainty in the whole of the world markets does at least increase the pressure on the government to actually acknowledge that further support is going to be needed for that industry?
I'm grateful to him for his comments, and he knows I've always got time for him to discuss the particularly challenging constituency issues he faces through the position at British Steel. Just to be clear, the announcement today is the formal step necessary to engage with British business about the announcements last night. That is an important stage that we need to take and the right way forward, and we've been prepared for this stage. In relation to the other challenges around the steel industry, look, this is a particularly challenging situation. He knows this better than anyone, as well as my honourable friend for Scunthorpe. And our commitment to doing this, even in difficult circumstances, is absolute. We will continue that, and I'll continue to keep him and his constituents updated at all times.
Emily Thornbury.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many of us may remember a time when Boris Johnson and many of those on the benches opposite claimed that a trade deal with Donald Trump could increase our trade with the US up to 5 times. It was clearly more difficult than they thought, but it is important to learn from failure. And I wondered if they had been in a position to be able to pass on any pearls of wisdom or any advice, or maybe even an oven-ready deal that might be able to help the country at this time of difficulties.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I would say I've been in touch with a lot of people who have been this country's business secretary, including some Conservative colleagues who remain in touch, and I find that at times to be a very useful, very worthwhile thing. I can't tell her I'm in touch with Boris Johnson on this or any other matter. I'd also say, in terms of the work of the previous government, that there wasn't anything substantive negotiated in terms of the trade talks that they'd had with the US. So this is a very different situation, but one where I do think, if we get it right, there are gains, as I say, not just to avoid what was announced last night and before that in relation to steel and aluminium and automotive tariffs, but actually to genuinely improve that trading relationship to mutual benefits on both sides.
Desmond Swain.
Tariffs are always and everywhere a diminution of the choice available to consumers. So it isn't Liberation Day, it's the very antithesis. And I hope he will bear that in mind as he considers the policy and the consultation on any retaliatory action.
I'm grateful to him for how he has put that. I think he is right in terms of where the burdens fall of policy in that area. It is not in anyone's interest. No one wins a trade war. That's impossible to be able to do, but it does require us to react in a way which is calm, which is reassuring, which is pragmatic, and seeks a way forward. And I can tell him that is exactly what this government will be seeking to do.
Andrew Cooper.
Can I thank the Secretary of State and his colleagues for all he's done so far in negotiating an economic partnership deal with the US. The automotive sector is an incredibly important one for Cheshire and Merseyside, both in terms of manufacturers like Bentley, Vauxhall and Jaguar Land Rover, and the wider supply chain, which supports employment of tens of thousands. The US is the biggest export market for Bentley Motors and Crewe, so they're likely to be at the sharp end of these tariffs. We all hope that his calm-headed approach has meant that we're in the best position to secure a deal. But what specific support does he have in mind for the automotive sector to help them weather this storm?
extremely grateful to him for that question, and he's right to highlight I'm tremendously proud of our automotive sector. He may know I come myself from one of our powerhouses of the automotive sector, Sunderland, and the Nissan plant where I grew up. And so it's incredibly important to lots of communities, the supply chain all around the UK, but particularly to our exports, and the US is a key market for that, particularly for the high-value models, some of which he mentioned, which are, again, incredibly valuable to this country, and we would want and seek to maintain that success. The kind of support that we will, first of all, it's dealing with this issue, and second of all, things like the announcement in the budget of the £2 billion for collaboration with the private sector in the automotive field, the money incentives for electric vehicle infrastructure, and of course the changes we're consulting on and about to publish a response to on the wider ZEV mandate, where we do need a more pragmatic response than we've seen in the past.
Thank you, Madam Deputy. Despite the UK having a trade deficit with the UK, and despite the best efforts of this government, including the Secretary of State, for whom I have a great deal of personal respect, the reality is that we have still been hit by significant tariffs from the States. And for people at home right now, they'll be worried about jobs, they'll be worried about inflation, and they'll be worried about the global headwinds which are undoubtedly going to hit us, irrespective of our own tariff situation. One industry in particular back home in Scotland who will be watching on with eager eyes right now is the Scotch whisky industry, given the £1 billion worth of exports which go to the United States. Now, I don't want the Secretary of State to try and control, nor could he, Trump's tariffs policy, but what he can do is control his own domestic taxation regime. So will he take this opportunity to re-engage with the Chancellor in and around the Scotch whisky taxation status?
I'm grateful to him for that question, and he knows that the value that we place as a department on the incredible product, which is Scotch whisky. We have a particular set of policy initiatives based on geographic indicators to make sure the brand is protected, and always doing everything I can to support Scotch whisky, which is, I think, just something that is absolutely world-class and always will be. He is right to say our success, joint success in Scotch whisky, produces a prominence which sometimes makes it vulnerable to retaliatory measures because of the recognition that exists about the success in that field. On domestic policy, I remain in close contact with the Chancellor on all matters, and will do on this one. I would also say there are tremendous opportunities for Scotch whisky from some of the other trade negotiations that we're having, India in particular, which is the biggest whisky market in the world, as he will know, where I think there could be real steps forward in terms of our market access and the arrangements that we have that will give us an advantage over other countries, and that is also a prominent part of our work.
Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. War does not benefit anyone, and a trade war between the UK and its closest ally will not benefit our industry nor our people, and will stifle our ability to grow our way out of 14 years of Conservative mess. For this reason, I thank the Minister for his pragmatic and cool-headed approach. But these measures also threaten our ability to prevent military conflict here on the continent of Europe. And I ask him to detail what action he is taking to ensure that our air and space industry can work with our European partners in order to implement the defence industrial strategy, which is central to ensuring peace here in Europe.
I thank him for that question. He is absolutely right in his assessment of the burdens and the benefits of solving the kind of challenge that we have been faced with from the announcements yesterday evening. He will know that the defence sector is one of the 8 priority sectors of our industrial strategy. There's a whole range of work across areas like air and space that we are engaged in with our colleagues around with the MOD. We also, of course, have had that significant increase in defence spending, which is a crucial part of how we respond to these threats. And the US will always be a crucial security ally for us, and our shared interests, whether they're economic, whether they're in the defence and security space, are enduring, and that should be something we always bear in mind when we're trying to find a way through this.
Sir Christopher Chen. Yes, Christopher, yes. Sir Christopher Chen, yes.
Sorry? Christopher? Yes. Sorry. Madam Deputy Speaker, can I say to the Secretary of State that I very much support his concerns about the automotive industry in this country. Will he therefore take action immediately to remove the arbitrary restrictions upon the ability of our own domestic motor manufacturers to produce and sell vehicles with internal combustion engines? Because that policy of the government has already reduced by 1/3 the domestic production of vehicles in this country between February last year and February this year? And also, why doesn't he lead by example now and remove all tariffs on US vehicles?
Thank him for his words about the automotive sector. In terms of the ZEV mandate is what he's referencing. That's a policy of the previous government, to be clear. We have inherited that policy. The consultation we have opened with our colleagues in DESNES and the Department for Transport is to look at that in the context of a fall across all European markets in automotive production and demand, and this incredible entry onto the world economy of increased Chinese production, which is a challenge for all of us. He will also know that our automotive sector is very much an export-led sector. We export 80% of what we make, and all of our key markets have the kind of transition policies in place towards electric vehicles. So if we didn't make that transition, we wouldn't have a product to sell in those key markets. So we have to work with industry to do it, but we have to recognise what we did inherit with respect from the Conservative Party wasn't something I thought was working, and that is why we've opened the consultation and will publish a response to that very soon.
Dean Sullivan.
Deputy Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and the effort of him and his team thus far, and also welcome the fact that there will be engagement with businesses on the potential for retaliatory action. I think that input is vital. Whilst the UK has a low rate of reciprocal tariff, it will be cold comfort to many businesses in my constituency of Bathgate and Lithgow, and indeed for those in the whisky and salmon industries that employ thousands of people across Scotland. Can the Secretary of State assure the business community that he will work at pace with his team to secure a sustainable trade deal with lower tariffs and bring the much needed certainty to businesses and households across this country? Excellent question.
Well, I thank her for her support and the fact that we are taking steps to make sure all options are on the table in terms of the action we may need to take in future. I do think that is important. It is inevitable when an announcement of this magnitude has occurred that businesses will be concerned, and I understand that will be what her constituents are telling her this morning. I absolutely can assure her of the approach I've laid out today will be something we continue to work at pace towards, and I believe our tone, our assurances that we can give, and the fact we're approaching this with the calm-headed pragmatism I think is vital, will be part of how we can reassure businesses, and of course the work that we can do to get to that position that she articulates, a better set of terms of trade with the US, is the objective of the government.
Munira Wilson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Business Secretary said in his statement, "True strength comes in making the right choices at the right time." So could I ask him to assure parents, carers and young people up and down this country that he will show true strength with Donald Trump and his sidekick Elon Musk and make the right choice by refusing point blank to trade away our children's safety online in watering down in any way, shape or form the implementation of the Online Safety Act?
I'd say to her, I do believe strength is making the right choices at the right time in our national interest. I can tell her the talks I've had with my US counterparts are not with respect to do with what she has articulated. They're to do with goods, they're to do with services, they're to do with the regulation of professional bodies and all the things we would associate with normal trade talks around that. I would also say the United States is not seeking to make our children unsafe. It's not seeking to make our children more vulnerable. And I don't think that's the right approach to take to our key and core ally. I think sometimes the Liberal Democrats are inventing problems to try and propose that they are the solution to them. This is a conversation about trade. And I think it's just vitally important we keep it in that important and appropriate terms.
Harry Gardner.
Madam Deputy Speaker, there is a threat, but there's also an opportunity. So what measures is my right honourable friend taking to combat trade leakage and the diversion of goods produced in countries hit by high US tariffs that now may dump their products in the UK, undercutting our domestic producers? And what steps is he taking to encourage manufacturers based in those countries and indeed in the EU to relocate to the UK and export from here to the US to take advantage of our lower 10% tariff?
I'm grateful to him for raising what is one of, I think, the most important issues that we face, which is the impact of trade diversion, not just the relationship between the US and the UK, but what it means for goods that potentially would have gone to other countries coming to the UK market. That is something we have to be extremely vigilant about. He will know in terms of the tariffs that were already announced on steel and aluminium, that we have those safeguards in place, we have our own quotas, we have our own 25% tariff to protect domestic production and make sure that isn't the case. And I can tell them we stand ready to use those powers for any sector of the economy that we need to use them for, or indeed to take further powers if that is deemed to be necessary. I do want businesses to be based in the United Kingdom, to serve a whole range of markets from the United Kingdom. That's a pitch which is not just about the comparative position that we find ourselves in, but the kind of policies we put in place to ensure we've got that level of competitiveness that we need. That is something every country in the world is engaged in, but I can assure him, not so much in relation to these announcements last night, but to the wider agenda of the government. That is our commitment.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Tariffs are a tax on import paid by domestic businesses. As he's reflecting through over the forthcoming weeks and consulting with businesses, will he reflect on the taxes that he has raised on our own domestic businesses and think about whether that is an appropriate response to what's happening?
We always reflect on decisions we've made as the UK government. I'll say to him again, I think we've probably had this exchange a few times. I'm always willing to hear from the Conservative Party how they plan to fund their own spending plans, but they certainly didn't have those in the spending plans that we inherited. If the Conservative Party is ready to make a decision on that, we would love to hear from them. But until they do, stop criticising us for fixing your mess.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I hope the Secretary of State agrees with me that protectionism isn't the way to protect consumers and businesses. Our own history teaches us that the Tory Corn Laws kept working people impoverished for generations in this country. I hope that our approach will be that we should have free and fair trade with other countries and not see rising prices for British people, American people anywhere else in the world, and that we'll do our best to ensure that people's living standards rise by ensuring the fair and free flow of goods and services.
Okay, well, we talked about not really living the arguments of Brexit. The honourable friends brought up the Corn Laws, and I think about time we had that one again, I think, here. But he will know, actually, go back to those arguments in the past around imperial preference and the stance the Labour Party took. It was always for free trade, and that was because that makes, in particular, food and other goods and services cheaper for the people that we represent, and that's always been our history, that's always been our commitment. And I think what we are announcing today and how we are seeking a way through these difficult and disappointing sets of announcements is entirely consistent with our own history on the Labour Party and our commitment to internationalism.
Neville Roberts.
Some commentators are fawning over a 10% tariff simply because our nearest neighbours have been hit worse. Let's get real here. The 25% tariff on steel and aluminium will hit Wales's biggest export to the US, machinery and transport equipment. And it's a fact that the EU is Wales's greatest trading partner, with Welsh exports valued at £11.2 billion. In the face of an American president and his obsession with international economic revenge, does the Minister recognise that it is economic common sense to accelerate scrapping trade barriers with Europe?
Question, and again she can see no one in this government is fawning over the relative position we find ourselves in. That is why we are so determined to find a better way through that. She's right to say, particularly the announcement on iron, on steel and aluminium, particularly the potential for what are called derivative tariffs, so on a product that is not in itself the raw steel and aluminium product, but on the product that is produced from those, is a real danger to us, and that's why we're taking that so seriously. We have an ambitious commitment to the EU reset. We need a partner on the other side, and there's been some political relative instability in some key European partners, and they've got to be in a position to have that conversation. But I say again, this is not a choice between the US and the EU. We can tackle this together. We can improve our trading relationship with both partners, and with India, and with the Gulf, and with other parts of the world. And that is the commitment of this government to do so.
Luke Murphy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In January 2017, the then Conservative Foreign Secretary claimed that the UK would be first in line for a US trade deal. 2,722 days later, when the Conservatives left office, precisely nothing had been achieved. Incidentally, that's 37 times longer than the 73 days that President Trump has been in power for his second term. So does the Business Secretary agree with me that it's hard to take the party opposite's criticisms of our trade approach seriously, given their appalling record on their claims of being able to achieve trade deals? And can I urge him to continue the calm approach with which he is approaching this in the interest of businesses across the country, in Basingstoke, and take those decisions in the national interest?
Grateful to my honourable friend for his support and the words that he has said. That there was no real progress on a federal level with the US under the previous government. The former president did have a decision he wouldn't pursue trade deals, so there wasn't perhaps much they could do on that. But I do sometimes reflect that the Conservative government broke our relationship with our nearest and most important trading partner, which is the European Union. It then fell out with countries in the Gulf and couldn't do that deal. It couldn't do the deal with India. It wouldn't engage with China. For a global Britain policy, there's not much of the globe left if you find yourself in that position. So not really best practice for us to follow, but we welcome the support for our approach if it exists on the other side and continue to say this is surely the right way forward for all of our constituents.
John Lamont.
Thank you very much. Farming, textiles and whisky are all important parts of the economy in the Scottish borders, but also more broadly across Scotland, and will be affected by these tariffs. But there are also very real concerns in Scotland that products currently heading to the United States markets from other countries will be redirected and dumped into the UK market, which will impact the domestic market. So I wonder what action the Government is taking to address that, and will he undertake to engage with the National Farmers Union of Scotland, the Scottish Whisky Association and other representatives of industry in Scotland to ensure that this problem is tackled head-on?
I absolutely agree with him. This is one of the principal issues that we have to address, whether it's farming, whether it's textiles, whether it's whisky. The impact of what is going on in the rest of the world in their relationship to the US has a direct impact, even though it's not the conversation that relates directly to the conversation about tariffs and our own trade deal with the US. So I can tell him I'm meeting the Chair and Chief Executive of the Trade Remedies Authority imminently. This is a crucial part of the work we have to get right. We do have, for some of the existing announcements, particularly steel and aluminium, things already in place, but we've got to make sure we're ready for other sectors of the economy too.
Rachel Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many of my constituents in North Warwickshire and Bedworth work at Jaguar Land Rover or in the motor manufacturing supply chain, and they are really concerned about 25% tariffs for exports to the US. Can the Secretary of State set out what steps he's taking to get these tariffs reduced and to support West Midlands businesses before I meet with Jaguar Land Rover later today? And does he agree with me that a calm and measured approach is exactly what is needed to get the best deal for British businesses?
Yeah.
Again, extremely grateful to my honourable friend for her question. JLR are an example of an incredible UK-based business in terms of their success in the US, but also in China and other parts of the world. We want to maintain that. We want to give them the platform they need for that success. And I can tell her I'm in personal, regular contact at the most senior levels with JLR. I'm delighted to hear she's meeting with them today to share some of these messages of reassurance. I know, like all businesses, they support, as we do, this calm, pragmatic, rational approach, seeking to find a better trade relationship with the US, to improve the relationship, not just to have and avoid the imposition of what was announced yesterday evening.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The previous government undertook secretive trade negotiations with the USA and included health in that. Could he assure the House that in any discussions of a bilateral nature with the USA, there will be no question of US private healthcare interests coming into Britain to undermine our National Health Service or indeed take over sections of our National Health Service?
Grateful for that question. That he knows I don't comment on the detail of talks, but I can tell him there have been no discussions in relation to the NHS or anything that would concern him in that regard. This is about goods and services and how we recognise each other's standards, but there's nothing relating to the health sector that I've been able to talk about with US counterparts. I hope he finds that a reassurance.
Chris Curtis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The automotive industry is incredibly important for workers in Milton Keynes, with many headquarters based there, such as Volkswagen. I realise that these tariffs are going to be incredibly difficult for the automotive sector, and it's good to hear what he said about looking for a pragmatic approach to the Z mandate. Can he also let us know what else he's going to be doing in order to support the automotive industry here in the UK?
Well, I thank him for his question and his support. He has some tremendous businesses based in his area. It's great having him here as a champion for them, particularly around the automotive sector. Look, it is about the regulatory environment, which we have discussed. It's about the funding that we make available for co-investment with the private sector, which is always a priority, £2 billion allocated for that in the budget. We've got to accelerate and improve our electric vehicle charging infrastructure. I think it's £300 million in the budget in relation to that. And look, the pressures on automotive across Europe are very, very fierce. I think that is widely recognised. Changes in consumer demand, much more competition from China coming in to the market around that. So we've got to make sure that we are serious about making sure the UK is the place to be a producer of automotive vehicles. My personal commitment to that is very, very strong, and I thank him for his question.
Eastwood.
Speaker, I thank the Minister, Secretary of State for his response so far and his statement on Northern Ireland. I trust that he will be continuing to engage with my colleagues in the Northern Ireland Executive in the days ahead. However, I have some real concerns that you have not been able to allay my fears around the inclusion or the possible inclusion of online safety within any possible USD. Will the Secretary of State be able to reassure me and the Molly Rose Foundation that no more young lives will be sacrificed in order to try and get a deal with the US?
Yeah. Well, I thank you for a question in reference to Northern Ireland. As I said, I updated the First Minister and Deputy First Minister yesterday. It is a particular situation that we need to remain very much aligned of and to, and making sure the system is working as it should, difficult as that will be. She knows I'm not going into the specific negotiations of any part of a deal, but I seriously say to any colleague, I believe their concerns are misplaced if they think this is what a negotiation is about. It's about goods and services and regulation, and that is what we're focused on delivering.
Sally Jameson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister has rightly said that this Labour government will always work in the national interest. So can the Secretary of State assure the House that it is in our national interest to protect the copyright of our creative industries and the £126 billion of economic power they bring to Great Britain?
Grateful for that question. The creative industries are not just a wonderful cultural asset to the UK, they're a tremendous economic asset as well. I don't necessarily agree with some of the commentary we see in places in the media that posits a sort of tension between being a creative powerhouse and the tech sector. I think there's a way through that, and that's what certainly my work in government is seeking to achieve. But I think we all recognise that the economic impact on the UK of our creative sector, the cultural soft power that comes from that, and the huge asset that it represents. That's always first and foremost in our thoughts.
Dr Neil Shastrihurst.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it is estimated that 25,000 jobs directly linked to the automotive sector are at risk due to the reduced exports to the United States. That is a deep concern to many of my constituents who work at either JLR in Solihull or Aston Martin in Gaydon. With that in mind, can the Secretary of State set out what specific steps he's taking to protect those jobs and whether it will involve reforming the regulatory environment in which they operate in?
I've seen I think it references the IPPR report with that figure in, and of course, because the automotive sector is such a jewel in our crown, we were all aware of what would happen if we were not able to find a way through that. So our work to find that deal, to remove this threat of tariffs, is precisely in order to deliver that. I actually met with Aston Martin yesterday as an example of the work we're trying to do. He asks a specific question about that regulatory environment that we inherited. I can't preempt the publication of the consultation, but it has just finished. But I think he's aware of comments I've made publicly about the recognition of changing that to reflect different circumstances. He won't have to wait very long for the outcome to be published of that, and I can tell him myself, the Secretary of State for Transport, the Energy Secretary, Net Zero Secretary, are all aligned on making sure we get this regulatory environment correct for the future.
Liam Conlon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State and his colleagues for the practical and pragmatic approach they have taken to put us in the best possible position with the US? Does he agree with me that, as well as the US, political and economic cooperation with our European friends and neighbours is also essential and in our best interests?
It absolutely is, and as I say, there's no tension between those two things. It's a false choice if people try and present it in that way, and I'm particularly looking forward to some of the progress I hope we'll make in our relationship with the European Union. It's not looking to the past, it's looking to the future, and of course it's in both of our interests to do so.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The US is clearly seeking concessions from the UK, and it has been widely speculated that the UK government is considering a reduction in the digital services tax as a way of placating Trump and his ally Elon Musk. My honourable friend, the member for St Albans, asked the Secretary of State, but I didn't quite catch an answer in his response. So will the Secretary of State commit today not to cut the digital services tax, as it's the way the tech giants pay their fair share here in the UK?
Well, She's heard me say repeatedly that I'm not going to go into the specific negotiations, but making sure any tech company, not just a US tech company, any tech company, pays a fair rate of taxation in the UK for the economic activity that they have in the UK is something all parts of the British government are committed to, and she doesn't need to be worried about that. I would just say, look, there's always going to be, in any discussion, a lot of issues that need to be dealt with. And in the main, those are trade issues. And I understand there's all kinds of speculation. Speculation isn't always correct. And I would just ask all colleagues to bear that in mind. Understand we can't publicly, in negotiation like this, share every single aspect of it. But if she's worried about US companies or any tech companies paying the right rate of tax in the UK, I can tell that's something we're deeply committed to.
Josh Dean. Oh. Oh my goodness. David Costigan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Secretary of State agree that now is the time for unity across the chamber in the national interest? And in contrast to the politicking we had earlier from the Conservative Shadow Minister, will he commit that